the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And this is one of these controversial symbols in 1930s diplomatic history. How do you interpret this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, really on the cusp of the start of the European theatre of World War II?
I consider it to be the Soviet Plan B. It was an undesirable option, but necessary in view of the positions of the French and British governments with respect to a war-fighting alliance against Nazi Germany.
Perhaps we could just begin with, I guess, the situation in sort of 1936. Last time we talked about how the Rhineland crisis, the purges in the Soviet Union and the Spanish Civil War reflected a situation where the attempt by the Soviet Union and its key diplomat, Litvinov, and the other leaders to form an anti-Nazi, anti-German alliance had failed or was starting to fall apart. But how would you characterise international relations and specifically Soviet-German relations at this time in the few years before the war?
It was a period of one crisis after the other, beginning with the Rhineland crisis. The Spanish Civil War, 1937, was kind of a relatively quiet year, but the Germans were building up their military power. The Spanish Civil War was going the wrong way if you were an anti-fascist. And then all hell broke loose in 1938 and in 1939. And it was just those last 3 years were dark years in the history of Europe and in the lead up to the outbreak of war in September 1939.
And Soviet-German relations in particular, because I guess if from some people's point of view, the keystone of these years is, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I mean, is that expression of what Stalin really wanted to happen? What was really going on in Soviet-German relations in this time?
Well, do we ever talk about Mein Kampf?
I'm not sure if we have, really. Yeah,
well,
we should do that.
I raised the subject because Mein Kampf was this sort of autobiography blueprint for the German domination of Europe right up to the Ural Mountains. It was published in 1925, and it was known by some people in the 1930s, and I'm thinking in particular of Maximovich Litvinov, who we've talked about quite a lot in our previous sessions. And the reason I raised it is because at the beginning of 1933, after Hitler was named chancellor, there were a lot of meetings between Litvinov and other Soviet diplomats with the German counterparts. And one of the subjects that often came up was Mein Kampf. Litvinov would sort of say, the German ambassador would say, oh, well, don't take Hitler too seriously. We're still interested in good relations with Moscow and continuation of the policy in the 1920s. Litvinov would smile benignly, and then there'd be a sort of a pause, and he would then say, well, what about Mein Kampf? I mean, if we read Mein Kampf, it's Hitler says he wants to conquer all of Europe and destroy the Soviet Union and destroy France. And German diplomats were kind of stuck, and they'd say, oh, well, Hitler wrote that in the 1920s. He was a little nutty back then. Don't pay any attention to it now. It's past history. And Litvinov didn't believe him. Believed these stories that he heard from German diplomats. And anyway, almost immediately, Soviet policy towards Germany began to change to building up a defensive alliance against Nazi Germany, and for most of that period, from 1933 to 1939, German Soviet relations were cold, distant, poor. Litvinov was afraid at times that the German government was about to break off diplomatic relations with the Soviet government. It's a bit paradoxical, but Litvinov favored the continuation of economic relations with Germany on a modest sort of scale, in order to prevent what he feared might become a rupture of Soviet-German relations and the complete isolation of the Soviet Union and a gang up of the West against the Soviet Union. And that policy, with ups and downs, continued right up until 1939. And the big change that suddenly came about began at the end of July 1939. Mm-hmm. And the concoction and conclusion of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was something that occurred over a matter of 3-4 weeks.
Indeed. And I recall reading Ulrich's big 2-volume biography of Adolf Hitler, which includes various quotations from after Mein Kampf, where, it's really the same sort of basic idea, expressed even more in more brutal and, I guess you'd say racist sort of language, or certainly prejudiced language, let's say, really comes through as well.
It's very interesting to read Litvinov's instructions that he sent to his ambassador in Prague, how careful the wording of the instructions are to back Czechoslovakia, but not overextending Soviet commitments before the French intervened on behalf of Czechoslovakia. So, to make a long story short, Litvinov continued, in spite of everything, to try to wake up the French and the British to the dangers that they faced. Mm. He failed.
The Munich 1938 conference, so when does that occur in 1938? And how does it kind of fit in with the broad sequence of events?
Basically, Munich was the work of Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain had this idea that he could negotiate serious agreements with Adolf Hitler. I trust him, he told. Those are his exact words. I trust Hitler. He told labor leaders, I trust leader. I've met Hitler, and I've taken his measure, and I trust him. And you, he's talking to these labor leaders, you have not done that. Why he thought he could trust Hitler, and why he thought he could negotiate viable agreements with Hitler, I think you have to explain through his desire not to cooperate with the Soviet Union under any circumstances. Anyway, Munich, September 1938, Chamberlain decides almost on his own, with barely any consultation with cabinet, that he's going to go to Germany, negotiate directly with Hitler. He makes 2 trips to Germany to see Hitler. Neither neither meeting is successful, and Hitler just keeps on upping his demands to Chamberlain. And it looked like in the third week of September, like a war was a strong possibility. Outbreak of war was a strong possibility because of Hitler's upping of demands to Chamberlain. At this point, Mussolini intervenes to propose a conference between Germany, Nazi Germany, Italy, Britain, and France to resolve the Czechoslovak crisis difficulties peacefully. And Chamberlain at once accepts the invitation to go. Daladier in Paris agrees to go. At meetings that took place at the very end of September, Chamberlain and Daladier accept the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and the passing to Germany of the so-called Sudeten territories where there were large populations of German-speaking people. And what else can I say? It was the sad.
So,
there's one.
So
one
the
other thing
Soviet Union were not invited, sort of thing. They weren't participants.
No, they weren't.
So it was just this select group of Italy, France,
and neither was the Czechoslovak side.
So sort of
was-
nothing
it was-
nothing about Czechoslovakia with Czechoslovakia.
No, there's something else that I should say. Well, what happens is that in March of 1939, the Hitler sends the German army into Czechoslovakia, and they just they take it over. The western part of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, becomes part of Germany, and a puppet state is a Slovak puppet state is set up in the east, and Czechoslovakia disappears.
Mm.
And the disappearance of Czechoslovakia was a kind of a wake-up call, because Germany had said, Hitler had always promised, this is my last demand, I won't make any more. And of course he did. He kept making demands. And a week or two later, German populated city of Memel, which was then part of Lithuania, was also taken over by the Germans. So, basically, if you were looking at the situation in March and April of 1939, you'd be hard pressed not to fear the outbreak of war in Europe in fairly short order.
Yeah. And indeed, I think you title your chapter about the sort of mood in the Soviet Union, the mood in Moscow in 1939, as sort of despair and hope. And I guess this is the last, I guess, desperate 6 to 12 months of trying to prevent the looming catastrophe. How did the Soviet foreign policy sort of decision makers respond to events after the Czechoslovak crisis? I mean, they've got war in Asia, they've on their eastern border, they've got war, the takeover of a critical country. They can see the writing on the wall, I guess. What's going on in Moscow at this time?
It's a remarkable thing. Litvinov and the Stalin leadership, I don't know how to put it, held the British and French in contempt. That's true, but they also hadn't quite given up hope in getting the French and the British on side. You can read the position of Litvinov in this various correspondence that in spite of everything, he still held out hope for agreement with the French and the British, and he held out hope for agreement with the French and the British because it was the only option. It was the only option to preserve what was left of European security and of setting up a defensive alliance to corral Nazi Germany. And it's, in a way, it's quite remarkable that the Soviet side held that position, and it speaks to the realism of Soviet foreign policy making, in spite of everything, every disappointment that the Soviet side had experienced in their dealings with, especially with the French and the British.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, I don't want to repeat what we've already discussed in previous discussions, but, the Soviet side made a formal, on the 17th of April, the Soviet side made a formal proposal to the French and the British for an alliance, a warfighting alliance, basically, political and military alliance against Germany. And you would have thought that the British and the French, facing an impossible situation in the event of war with Nazi Germany, would have seized the Soviet proposal with both hands. But they did not do so. The British connived and zigzagged and ultimately refused the Soviet offer of alliance, and the French, who were more desperate than the British and didn't have the English Channel as a kind of defensive moat to protect Britain, British Isles, were more desperate and tried to connive and wheedle the British into some kind of rotten compromise with the Soviet side, which would at least give the appearance of cooperation with the Soviet side. And there's one interesting event that I'd like to share with your listeners, and that is, when I was just finishing up the second volume, Stalin's Failed Alliance, just before the text was going to be locked in with the publishers. I don't think I've told you this story, but I for years had been trying to get hold of Litvinov's 1939 correspondence with Stalin. I haven't told this story, have I? I don't think so.
No.
Okay. So I made one last try with the Foreign Ministry archives in Moscow to get hold of Litvinov's correspondence with Stalin in 1939. And to my great surprise, they said, "Okay, you can look at the file." And so I got to look at the letters in this file, and there were some letters that hadn't been published before. And the last letter in the file is dated the 3rd of May, 1939. That was the day that Litvinov was sacked. And in that letter, Litvinov basically says to Stalin, I give up. I give up. I don't think that we can count on an agreement with the French and the British, and we have to think of other priorities. And later that day, in the afternoon, Litvinov is called into a meeting with Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov, who was Stalin's right arm, and he was sacked at that meeting. And the circumstantial evidence suggests that Litvinov was sacked because he gave up. He gave up, and that Stalin and Molotov wanted to continue to try to obtain cooperation with the French and the British. And what's really interesting is that the common explanation for Litvinov's sacking was that he was of Jewish origin, and that Stalin was thinking already of an agreement with the Germans, and that they couldn't have Litvinov as foreign commissar if they were going to make an agreement with the Germans, because Litvinov would never go along with it. But in actual fact, the circumstantial evidence indicates that he was sacked because he'd given up on a policy which he himself had recommended, and that Stalin and Molotov were not at that point prepared to accept. And in fact, the messages that they sent out after Litvinov's sacking was that Soviet policy had not changed. It was still to favor cooperation with France and Britain against Nazi Germany.
So he's sort of removed because he's sort of lost the will to do, what he needs to do.
Circumstantially, that's what it looks like.
Yeah. Rather than that he's proposing something other than what the leadership wants to happen.
It's kind of sad. It's kind of sad in a way, because here's Litvinov fighting all these years, and at the end he becomes discouraged, and he throws in the towel, it looks like.
Yeah. I mean, you can understand it at a human level. I mean, what he's just gone through over the last 10 years or so. But does he ever come back into high office? Yeah, he does. He does subsequently. Like, he's sort of there in the sort of early Cold War, isn't he?
He becomes Soviet ambassador in Washington, and he arrives in Washington just before the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
And he's ambassador in Washington until the middle of 1943, and then he goes back to Moscow, and he's named a deputy commissar, and he works on post-war planning.
Yeah.
And what you're referring to is a reported conversation with a Western journalist, forget his name, to the effect that he didn't approve of Stalin's hardening position towards the West. I think it was in 1946. I could be corrected on that, but it's after the end of the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not convinced that he really said that to the Germans. I'd like to see. I'm not fully convinced about that, but that's the standard line.
Indeed. Well, journalists have never been known to ever misreport anything, have they? Especially American journalists. Well, the man who sacks, one of the men who helps sack Litvinov goes on, Vyacheslav Molotov, goes on to pen the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And of course, this is, one of these controversial symbols in 1930s diplomatic history. How do you interpret this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, really on the cusp of the start of the European theatre of World War II?
I consider it to be the Soviet Plan B. It was an undesirable option, but necessary in view of the positions of the French and British governments with respect to a war-fighting alliance against Nazi Germany. One of the interesting things surrounding, the Nazi Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was the idea that it was something unexpected by the French and the British, and that it was a failure, notably of MI6 in London to detect preparations for the conclusion of this agreement. But that's not true. That line of argument is not true. There were three French ambassadors in Moscow between 1933 and 1939, and all three of them, at one time or another, sent reports to Paris, warning that if France neglected its relationship with Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union could undertake a volte-face and reestablish cooperative relations with Nazi Germany in spite of everything. And these reports were filed. We know about them now because they're still in the French archives, and you can read them. And as a historian reading these reports, you have to wonder why there was not. Well, I don't wonder, but some people might wonder why there was not more attention paid to them. And it wasn't just the French ambassadors who were warning of the possibility of a Soviet volte-face. Daladier, with his horns of snail's horns, was openly worried about it and said so to the British at a meeting during the spring of 1939. The British chiefs of staff were worried and warned the government about the danger. And the iconic British cartoonist David Lowe, who was born in New Zealand but spent most of his life in the UK, published 3 cartoons during the summer of 1939 showing the Germans negotiators waiting outside the door of Molotov to get in to see him, to make an agreement with the Soviet side. And still, the standard British excuse during this period for not pursuing better relations with the Soviet Union was, my goodness, we don't want to provoke Herr Hitler. We don't want to provoke Herr Hitler. That was always an argument that was used. Okay, there were other arguments used as well, but that's a standard line that you hear when the British are making excuses for not warming to cooperative relations with the Soviet Union. And Stalin, he has I think it's in September of 39. Anyway, it's after the outbreak of war and the destruction of Poland. He has a meeting with the Turkish foreign ministry in Moscow, and he openly states that the Soviet preference was for an agreement with France and Britain against Nazi Germany. And in fact, Turkey was also Turkey was also in favor of a tripartite alliance, Soviet Union, France, Britain, against against Nazi Germany. And in fact, in the middle of August, the Turks proposed a mutual assistance pact with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. The Turks did. And at that point, it was too late. Mm-hmm. It was too late. Basically, to sum up, it was the plan B. It was the only possible solution. in the circumstances.
And indeed, that's remarkable, and it's something that's what you said about the offer of a alliance, a security alliance in April 1939 that the British rejected for no really sound reasons. It's something that is just never mentioned really, I think, in the popular memory kind of discussion of World War II. And you title, I think, what the maybe final chapter of Stalin's Failed Alliance, The Tragic End of Collective Security. And in there you write about this repeated efforts over years and years and years and years to form, the defensive alliance for collective security in Europe, and the constant rebuffs. And you say, the fact is that the only European power committed to mutual assistance against Nazi Germany was the USSR. Stalin and Litvinov launched their boat called Collective Security in December 1933. They got in and tried to persuade others to join them. But as we find out, they did not. There's not really, I guess, any direct lessons or parallels from this situation, but, I think there's a sort of Australian-Chinese historian, Wang Gongyu, who talks about history. Looking at history helps you grasp current situations perhaps more successfully. What would you sum up as some of the key issues to draw out of this failure to negotiate collective security in Europe in the 1930s, which led to, the tragedy of 70 million deaths?
In foreign policy, ministries of foreign affairs, their duty is to their principal duty is to protect the national interests of their country, and to be absolutely hard-nosed about it. That's a Chicago professor, Mersam.
Yeah.
He always likes to talk about realism. Set aside your ideological prejudices. Set everything aside except one thing. What are the interests of my country? And what is the best way to defend them while avoiding military confrontations or war? And the British and the French, during the interwar years, were unable to do that. And I know it will, judging from some of the comments that have been made about the previous discussions we have, I know that it comes as a surprise to some of our listeners that the Soviets were hard-nosed realists. And they were hard-nosed realists, and they remain hard-nosed realists. I would dare to hope that people in influential positions in the West would come around to recognize that and respond in like manner in the present difficult circumstances that we face presently.
Indeed.